Okay, sequence E, which is basically bookended by the midpoint, which is where the sequence begins, and ends with a yet another attempt to try to solve the problem, and ultimately a failure because it doesn't solve the main conflict in any particular way. But as we'll see, there should be a clear objective in the main character's storyline that is definitely sending him in more of the right direction. Now that he knows what the problem is, which the midpoint reveals the depth of the conflict, then the objectives and the strategies that the main character then tries to accomplish are have a better chance of succeeding now that he knows what the problem is. So we'll kind of see how that unfolds in this sequence E. And it should be a fairly straightforward sequence. And it's all based on, now that the midpoint reveals the problem, how does the main character respond? It is all based in the response that the main character has now that they know what they know. In The Matrix, there is a culmination at the midpoint. That means there's a coming together of storylines. One of them, two of them were set up at the midpoint in The Matrix. That is Cypher and the fact that he's a traitor, and also that Neo finds out, or he thinks that he's not the one, and that affects his decision making. And that's something that's critical in every feature story, is that in terms of the direction the story takes, it should all take a direction based on the decisions the main character makes, and the midpoint is a critical one because what ends up happening is Cypher has set them up. After Neo visits the Oracle, the agents are there waiting for them to try to capture them, and particularly Morpheus. And this is a setup. This is those two storylines coming together. Cypher's betrayal and Neo's journey to visit the Oracle and return to the Nebuchadnezzar. And we see what happens in the next sequence is basically twofold. Agents are there to capture Morpheus, which is what happens in that sequence in terms of the agent's objective, to capture Morpheus, and they capture him at the end of the sequence. And also Cypher, in terms of escaping the Matrix, so that he can then now be on the Nebuchadnezzar and pull the plug on everybody and continue the agent's sort of plan, his portion of that plan. And finally, Neo and his decision, which is, I can't let Morpheus sacrifice himself for me because I am not the one. So we see how all those storylines kind of culminate at this midpoint and turn into a reaction to this new information in the next sequence. In Jaws, it begins with Chief Brody. Now that he knows that the shark is in the estuary, we have a repetition of the shark attacks. He's very clear about it. His own children have been directly threatened by this shark. No more messing around for Chief Brody. He goes straight to the mayor and says, you're going to sign this piece of paper and we're going to hire Quint to kill the shark. As far as the mayor is concerned, he is no longer in opposition for Chief Brody. He is now asserting his authority, which is a very important line of conflict in the story. In a sense, he kind of overcomes it. It might be a little too late at this point in the story, but he is finally going to stand up to the mayor. He has him sign the documentation, and the next sequence is more or less him teaming up with Quint, the shark hunter. Hooper goes along, and it's basically a sequence of them preparing to go out on this boat to capture the shark. The sequence also continues as right up to the point where they first snag this shark and they think they've got him. So it's basically the first attempt to, at this point, the first attempt to try to capture the shark with this new strategy of using Quint. And, as we'll see, the rest of the film really unfolds with subsequent attempts to try to catch the shark. The stakes are being raised the whole time. And we haven't really talked about stakes and sort of following, how the stakes are being raised. But if you go back and you look at all the, how each sequence ends, you'll find that the stakes are being raised, every time the sequence ends. Something new is at stake. And as the conflict deepens, so do the stakes in terms of what the character stands to gain or lose. So that should be sequence E. And you should find, the characters, the storylines, the conflict should start to culminate. They start to affect one another. They complicate one another, and we see the main character make some decisions and react directly to what is revealed at the midpoint. And the sequence E ends with the result of that reaction, and ultimately taking on new strategies. Okay, so that's sequence E. We'll move on to sequence F and see what happens next when the bad guys close in.